It's nice to be here, to meet some old friends and all enjoying this conference. So why should we protect the Parnassius Apollo? The Apollo is a relatively big species of butterfly with a wingspan of about 10 centimeters that flies in hills and flowery alpine meadows in Scandinavia and several places in continental Europe, in Russia, Mongolia and China. It has white wings with 4 to 5 black spots on each of the front wings and 2 orange or red eye spots on the back wings. About 275 subspecies are described. In many countries, this butterfly is on the red list of threatened species. In the summer of this year, 2 tourists from a Scandinavian country were brought in by the police in Jotunheimen in Norway for collecting 35 to 40 specimens at a value on the illegal market of about €100 each. And if you go to the eBay and try to find the Parnassius Apollo, you can get prices from $40 to $1,500. Why should we protect Parnassius Apollo? Should we do so because it's rare, or because it's beautiful, or for some other reason? Or are there no reasons at all that we should protect it? Questions such as these could be posed and addressed from different angles by diverse environmental philosophies, and I suppose with different outcomes. My approach in the present paper is to discuss the topic from the point of view of Christian cosmology and spirituality. When God is brought into the picture, there emerges new ways to argue for the protection of wildlife and the environment. One is not limited to argue from immanent characteristics in the animal kingdom, like the ability to feel pleasure and pain, and the property of personhood, like in utilitarianism, or solely from the duties humans have towards themselves, like in deontology or Immanuel Kant. That the world is created by God, that God has left his mark on his work, and that the world is the sum total of creatures has a definite purpose, make a difference as to how creatures should be treated. It is not my intention to work out all the details of a Christian approach to the protection of the environment, but to sketch a framework that should be of importance for understanding of Christian obligations. In particular, I shall point to the relevance of virtue and contemplation in this regard. Christian cosmology is probably not a term all members of Christian denominations are familiar with. For some Christian groups, Christianity has no cosmology, and such groups will find it difficult or even non-interesting to address the environmental question or problems from a theological point of view. In fact, some will say that we need not bother, since the second coming is imminent and this world passes away at the final judgment. In ancient Christian thought, however, there is a cosmology. This cosmology somehow lives on in present-day churches with ancient roots, even if the practical or ethical challenges such a cosmology pose, unfortunately, are not much heeded. I based the argument of this paper mainly on the late antique thinker St Maximus the Confessor. In doing so, I shall claim that environmental issues may be approached in a practical as well as a contemplative way in the Maximian sense of these terms. For Maximus, the created world has its beginning and end in God. And the dynamics of this world, centered in the human being, has a soteriological significance. First, we shall notice that from a Maximian point of view, the world does not contain any waste, or to put it otherwise, any superfluous kinds of natural things. From the point of view of evolution, such a claim is, I should think, meaningless. What there is not the result of any purpose, but simply because of the blind mechanism of natural selection. From a Christian point of view, even if given a mechanism of natural selection, evolution cannot be acknowledged as completely blind after all. However, how such a scientific claim should be grasped in relation to a claim of Christian metaphysics or cosmology is too large an issue to be entered into in this paper. Let me just postulate that the different claims can be formulated in such a way that they do not necessarily contradict one another. From a Maximian point of view, all beings, particulars as well as universals, are created by God from eternal logoi in Christ. These logoi are to be understood as the sum total of God's eternal knowledge of beings. On the one hand, the logoi are what God knows eternally, and on the other hand, they are principles according to which he creates beings temporally. If God is present in and even is the logos of each existing thing, universals and particulars, then each existing thing is an expression of the divine and somehow carries the mark of its maker. God willed each being and, as I said earlier, consequently there is no waste and nothing superfluous in the created world. The corollary of this is that the natural world as created is a theophany, and we need to investigate what practical, in a wide sense, consequences it has for the world, that the world somehow carries the marks of its maker. If the world is the result of the creative act of the good God, created being is good and beautiful in itself despite its fallen condition. All beings are designed by God and are expressions of the logoi contained in the logos. But how could creatures that are unpleasant, ugly, and even dangerous be said to be beautiful and witness to divine beauty and goodness? And here I have a quotation from Aristotle, The Parts of Animals, which is rather interesting, very famous passage. I dropped most of it, but just one sentence. Therefore, we must not betake ourselves to the consideration of the meaner animals with a bad grace, as though we were children, since in natural things there is something of the marvelous. For the eyes of science, the natural world is enjoyable and beautiful. Such fascination with natural things is not only found in an ancient pioneer of natural science like Aristotle. It may be found even in modern natural scientists. However, from the point of view of Maximian cosmology, there is a further dimension to this. The natural world plays a role in the grand soteriological scheme. The world is, of course, beautiful, since it is God's creation, and the seeming lack of beauty and the corruptibility that marks creatures in the present condition of things is finally to be transcended in the universal transformation of all creatures. Here we come to a central point of my argument. Maximus' idea of the spiritual development of human beings in the context of the notion of universal transformation. In a lot of places in his writings, we find sketches and elaborations of 3 stages of spiritual development. These are, in Maximian terminology, practical philosophy, natural contemplation, and mystical theology. These are not necessarily successive stages, but at least not the 2 first. Even if practical philosophy is the foundation of natural contemplation, it seems that these 2 stages condition one another mutually. Practical philosophy is the development of virtues. In regard to this, we find that humans, even in the fallen condition, bear traces of virtues in their divinely instituted nature. In his disputation with Pyrrhus, Maximus says that virtues are natural. The reason why not all of us are virtuous is that, as he says, we do not all practice what is natural to us in an equal degree. In one sketch of a logical sequence of the development of virtues in the centuries of love, we find that it culminates in detachment or dispassion and love. Maximus sees these two virtues as crucial, and I quote him, "Love is a holy state of the soul, disposing it to value knowledge of God above all created things. We cannot attain lasting possession of such a love while we are still attached to anything worldly." This statement sounds a bit alarming in the present context. Does it not suggest that we should transcend the created world, leaving it behind us for the sake of the knowledge of God? Does it not say that the spiritual goal of humans is beyond the corruptible world, as if this world was of no significance? I claim, however, that this problem is a seeming one. Both the quote and Maximus' further development of the topic of virtues give us a different picture. What is meant with the term knowledge of God? What may we know of God? According to Maximus, God the Word has revealed himself in three different ways: in the logos of creatures, in the logos of scriptures, and in the historical incarnation of Jesus Christ. We may know God through searching out all three ways. One important aspect of knowledge of God is to know God through his theophany, in his manifestation as creator in the making of universals and particulars in this world. The dispassionate or detached state that is a condition for the manifestation of love of God is a condition in which we are not attached to anything worldly. We are not attached in the sense that we are no longer bound to the sensible surface aspect of natural things that triggers desire. The meaning of detachment is not to abandon material beings, but to achieve a change in our attitude towards them. They are no longer considered just for their usefulness. They are no longer conceived simply as resources we have an unlimited right to exploit in order to satisfy our appetites. Detachment, then, is a condition of love, but attachment is not abandonment altogether. It implies a renewed or changed attitude towards sensible creatures. For Maximus, the purpose of detachment is not to abandon the sensible world, but to be freed from all so-called cosmic distress, as he puts it somewhere. And I suppose this cosmic distress is what Maximus described as the dialectic of pleasure and pain that the human being exists in after the fall. The only way out of this condition is through the spiritual development that is made possible by Christ in the Church. What then of the highest virtue, that of love? Does it not once again sever our ties to the world, since it exclusively searches to know God? The Maximian system, however, does not allow the complete separation of the human being from the rest of the world. In Abigum 41, human nature is described as a microcosm in a grand sketch of the created cosmos. This microcosmic creature is actualized as such and fulfilled in its function as the mediator between God and all being when it becomes the human nature of the incarnate Logos of God. Human nature, therefore, is essential in Maximus' cosmos. The love that culminates in the development of virtues searches the knowledge of the divine source of all beings. For this reason, Maximus can say in the Centuries of Love that the one who loves God cannot help loving every human being as himself, and that the person of good and dispassionate judgment also loves all humans equally. However, this focus on human beings is not to the exclusion of other creatures, since the function of humanity as the human nature of the incarnate Logos is to interconnect all creatures in the movement of universal salvation. The general point here is that to know God is to know the one incarnate Logos that contains all the logoi of beings. Practical philosophy, then, reaches its peak in the love of God, a love that searches to know God, that is, to know God in the way God is available to us. In this love, the world that was earlier veiled or covered up and seen as a collection of entities for our use without any definite purpose, is now discovered in its splendor as a theophany. The world emerges as a cosmos that is contemplated in the light of the logoi of creatures. If the world is contemplated in this way, it emerges not as something indifferent, not as a simple resource for exploitation, but rather as divinely given and instituted. Our relationship with the world cannot any longer be directed by appetite, neither privately nor collectively, that is, in our economic systems. This obviously means that we are not allowed to use things that are at hand indiscriminately. However, this is a very general or global claim, and the question is if it can be made more explicit. How should we act when it comes to minerals, plants, and animals? How should we act when it comes to particular situations and details? It is a well-known critique of virtue ethics that it offers little concrete guidance when it comes to real challenges. There is no space in this to address this problem at any length in the present paper, but I shall only point to some features that characterize a Maximian virtue ethics. It does not consist in the learning of certain habitual. It does not consist just in the learning of certain habitual practices. For Maximus, who thinks virtues are natural, the conditions for such habitual practices are already present in human nature, but they need to be awakened and developed. The awakening and development of virtues culminate in a natural contemplation that, I will claim, should partly be manifested in a certain spiritual prudence with regard to how we should behave in relation to beings in our environment. The contemplative knows the world as a divinely instituted cosmos with a definite purpose, and will therefore strive to cooperate with God in the cosmic movement towards peace and harmony. Negatively speaking, acts of cruelty, inflicting of pain, the spread of fear, destruction of natural phenomena are to be avoided and transcended in order to achieve the opposite. So, why should we protect the Parnassius Apollo? Philosophically speaking, one might desire a convincing argument based on a utilitarian or deontological point of view. However, such a convincing and clear argument might be a bit difficult to make. Is the Apollo in any way useful for human beings? Would its presence in the world make us happy? Is it useful in the overall system of nature? A lot of such questions and their answers might be rather vague. Further, I suppose a deontologist would find it difficult to argue that we have any duties towards creatures of that kind. At most, we might have a duty towards ourselves to protect the Apollo, but why? And here I quote from Kant's Metaphysics of Morals. Still some time?
5 minutes.
No, 5 minutes. I quote Kant. A propensity to wanton destruction of what is beautiful in inanimate nature is opposed to a human being's duty to himself, for it weakens or uproots that feeling in him which, though not itself moral, is still a disposition of sensibility that greatly promotes morality, or at least prepares the way for it. The disposition, namely, to love something, for instance, beautiful crystal formations, the indescribable beauty of plants, even apart from any intention to use it. That was Kant. Even if Kant says here, even if what Kant says here is about inanimate things, I think it's relevant for the present question. According to Kant, we have no moral obligation, no duty to protect such a species, neither towards the Apollo itself, nor towards God. However, the propensity to destroy a beautiful thing weakens a feeling that promotes morality. Even if this is reasonable and true, from a Christian point of view, it alone cannot be satisfactory. The Norwegian poet Henrik Wergeland from the 19th century wrote a short, beautiful poem that unfortunately is not translated into English. The poem tells that the butterfly flew from the hand of God, who beautified it with golden wings and purple stripes. And this is probably just fancy, because there are no Scandinavian butterflies that answers to this description. Well, even so, the sentiment, or rather the knowledge that all creatures exist because God willed them to exist, and the ability to contemplate these same creatures as such, that is, as God's creatures, not as something useful for us or useful within the ecosystem, even though they might be useful in the ecosystem, reveal these creatures as valuable in another sense. Whether we understand it or not, whether we understand their usefulness or not, they are valued by God and cannot be treated in any inconsiderate way. They are, in fact, a reflection of the divine. There is a logos for them, both universally and as particulars. Let me try an analogy, and that is the last thing I shall do. If I make a watercolor painting and someone else takes it and tears it apart or uses it to light the fire in the fireplace, then I, as well as others, would react with consternation. However, when it comes to nature and natural entities, one seldom reacts in that way, even if nature and natural things belong to God, express his intentions, and are part of his scheme of regeneration. Since we do not respect nature as God's work of art, we need the contemplative view that becomes possible after development of virtues. If one finds this answer to the initial question about the protection of the Panasas Apollo too vague, I shall retort that I cannot see that modern approaches along utilitarian or deontological paths are any better off. As a matter of fact, Peter Singer has written an article called The Environment, and he has great difficulties with answering questions like, why should we protect the Panasas Apollo? From a Christian point of view, one cannot exclude God from the picture, and since God made the world, and since what he made is his, one has to develop an approach to nature that takes this simple fact into account. Human beings need to find the divinely set limits for their practices. The virtues and contemplative life will be of major importance in this search. It is very difficult to recommend certain set practices for each case, as if an algorithm could decide questions of behavior. Even so, in daily life, we should wish to have concrete a guidance as possible. Nothing can make good for the lack of contemplation and knowledge, but not all people are contemplative or knowledgeable. Guidance is needed, but where should one look for it? Thank you.